Welcome to Avodas HaParsha in the lovely neighborhood of Shiurei Chesed in the wonderful Kehillah of Ner Avram. Close enough. We had Am Yotze. I think it should be, yeah. Okay, now what we're going to try to do tonight are two things. We're going to look at the Nazir, the Parsha of the Nazir, and try to understand two difficult parts. Number one is a statement that Rashi brings down from the Gemara in Tainis, from Rebbe Elazar HaKapor. I was once in a museum in Katzrin up north, and they had like the front piece of the yeshiva. There was a stone thing engraved that said Zeh Yeshivoso Rebbe Elazar HaKapor, that they had found that. You almost expected to see the donated signs underneath it, would be Mr. and Mrs. Isaac Goldberg campus. Okay, so the Nazir, there's a pasuk here that describes a korban that he has to bring if he becomes tamei through being in the presence of a dead person in the halachic way that it would make him tamei. But the phrase used is me'asher chata al hanefesh, from the sin that he did al hanefesh. So the Mefarshim say is that this al hanefesh would be unnecessary if it's talking about the dead person, because we already know that he was tamei. You just say me'asher chata. His sin was a Nazir not allowed to become tamei, to be in the presence of the dead person in that way. So why say al hanefesh? So here Rebbe Elazar HaKapor said shetzir atzmo min hayayin, that his chet was that he caused himself discomfort by depriving himself of wine. When he took on the neder of nezirus, it's an optional. He took it upon himself, and suddenly, for that period of time, he can't drink wine. The minimal standard nezirus is 30 days. So he says that's an idea of chet. And I've seen it quoted many, many times, and it's given as an example of how the Torah wants us, right, to be able to enjoy the things that are here, and to deprive yourself of something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu put here that's allowed. And we see that we use wine for many things of Kedusha, right? From Kiddush and at weddings and at bris, at a Pidyon Ben, we're always picking up a cup of wine and doing. So that's why there's this idea of chet. So the two things we're going to try to look at is, number one, when you think about it, it's not so simple to say that the Nazir has an aspect of chet because he afflicted himself by depriving himself of wine. How can a mitzvah be a chet? In other words, the nezirus isn't a punishment. It's a mitzvah. It's an optional mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that you activate by taking a neder of nezirus. But once you do that, the Torah defines how you fulfill that neder of nezirus, and part of it is not drinking wine. So how can we say, adding to that, let's say, the famous drasha of Chazal, that we find the Parsha of Nazir right after the Parsha of Sota, right? And they say, why is that? Because Harah Sota bikil kula, if a Jew actually saw the punishment of the Sota, which is a complicated process and very rare, that would actually turn out that this woman really did commit that adultery, and that's only revealed by her drinking those waters, and then she has this terrible punishment and physical degradation. A person who sees that, yazir atzmo min hayayin, he should take upon himself a nezirus from wine. Parenthetically, question so many people ask is, why? You would think he's the person who's the most inoculated against adultery by seeing the terrible results. So one explanation is that even when you see something and it has terrible results, the very fact that you see that it really occurs weakens something in you. What you're seeing is that adultery occurred here. That weakens something inside of you, and you have to shore it up. You have to strengthen it up. So now we're going to be looking at the Shiurei Daas of Rabbi Yosef Yudalei Bloch of Telz, and he goes into this in a very deep way. So I'll try to make it clear in the time that we have. He says, how can something kadosh, the word, again, remember the word nazir comes from the word nezer, which means a crown, right? It means this is something lofty to do. A crown is that which is above the head. That's why a king wears a crown, because he is above the regular people of the nation. Hirsch says the idea of a nezer also is that it's round. that the Nazir somewhat surrounds himself with a barrier, right? Something which protects him. By the way, Rav Hirsch does say, pay attention, right? It's a horrible thing, the translations that they do when they translate English words into Hebrew and they misborrow. So monks and nuns, they'll call in modern Hebrew nezirim or nezirot. Absolutely not. The Nazir, remember, is married, and the Nazir has children, and the Nazir goes to work, and the Nazir goes to shul, right? He's not locked away. He's not a person who's alone. He's meant to be dafka among people and functioning, but for that period of time, he's supposed to be somewhat separated and dedicated, and that's what Kedusha means to us, separated and dedicated, in order to emphasize his connection to Hashem, the spiritual over the physical. Okay, but it is not that type of separation which is there. So how can the Nazir, right, who gets the title Kadosh, right, the word Kadosh is applied to him, and it's Nazir means a crown, how can such a person be called a chote, a sinner? So in Maseches Tainis, there's an argument, right? It starts off about the question of a person taking on a lot of fasting. Shmuel says, Kol hayoshev b'tainis nikar chote. A person who fasts often is called a sinner. And he is in sync. Savar ki aitana detanya belozar kappa. Rebbe, which means he was the Gadol Ador, said, why does it say that the Nazir needs atonement? Shetzir atzmo min hayayin. Okay, and Shmuel goes in agreement with that. Now the Gemara asks Shmuel, doesn't it? You realize that it also says that the Nazir is called Kadosh, right? And he says that refers to the idea of the hair, that his hair is actually has a state of kedusha. You can't get a hanah from his hair. You can't sell that hair and make a sheitel when the Nazir takes his hair off. Burn it under the pot, right, under the dud. So now the question is that Rabbi Lazar Akapar, though, who said that the Nazir is called a chote, he's called Kadosh, and also chote. In other words, he doesn't have to have this answer of Shmuel that it refers only to the hair. And Tosfos says, even according to Shmuel, you can have both things, meaning the Nazir can be doing a mitzvah, and he can be called Kadosh, but he's also sinning. Right? How can the two things be? He says it's in the same way that Shmuel says in Bava Kama that a person is allowed to harm himself, so to speak, by taking upon a fast. And even though that's something we view as negative, but nonetheless, in certain cases, if he has to do it for a mitzvah, so the mitzvah is greater than the avera which is there of him causing himself affliction. So Rav Bloch wants to take out of this is the original question we asked, how could something that is such a mitzvah be called an avera? And he says, because something can be both. Something can be both, and even though the Torah is telling you to do it, you have to realize that there's an aspect of chait there. Now, this is very mysterious, and he's going to explain why in a very deep way. He says, let's look at this Nazir. The Nazir comes, and why is he taking upon himself nezirus? He said, let's expand the image that Chazal said, Haroah sota b'kilkula. Someone who sees the sota and her degradation will want to take nezirus and separate from wine. Sota b'kilkula, he said, is any type of abuse of olam hazeh. Any type of abuse, overuse of olam hazeh, addiction to olam hazeh, to all the things that are here when things are not in balance. He's disgusted by it, and he wants to separate himself from it, right? This is what he sees, the sota b'kilkula. He wants to take a period of time to get his head straight, to detox, as they say, and to elevate himself, and that's what the purpose of his nezirus is. So what is the chait in doing that? So Rashi says that he is neglecting something that Chazal said in Maseches Hariyos, Daf Yud Amud Beis. Tzadike, I achle trei alma misani lahu. if a person is a tzaddik and he also enjoys olam hazeh, is that meant to be a bad thing? HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world to be enjoyed and enjoyed in the right way. So the Nazir, by creating this kind of backing off from this world and viewing this world as such a negative thing that he has to separate himself and take upon himself these different deprivations, he says that is something that has a negativity to it. But again, Rav Bloch comes back to the idea, nonetheless, but he's following the playbook of the mitzvah. How can you say that he's doing an Avera? That almost seems to say that the Torah is forcing him into doing an Avera once he accepted this nezirus. So he explains the following. After the chet of Eitz Daas tov v'ra, when Adam Rishon ate from that tree, Daas tov v'ra doesn't mean just intellectual knowledge, it means an intermingling of tov v'ra. From that time, right, everything in the world, even the most tov, also has in it ra. Okay, that's there in everything in the world, and therefore it'll be somewhat lacking. Now, even something that a person does with excellent intention and excellent desire, so the very fact that he's taking upon himself this thing to do, this awakens his inner self, all of it, the good in him and the bad in him, right? In other words, we have kochos inside of us. Sometimes they're lying in the subconscious, sometimes they're somewhat dormant, but when a person takes a big step, suddenly everything wakes up, right? He gives an interesting mashal for it. He says you have to view a person like almost a bibar. It's like a corral full of all different types of animals. You can have cows and you can have sheep, but you can have, right, leopards and snakes and scorpions and all sorts of things. Anything you do within that corral is going to wake up all the animals. Okay, you go in there and you clap your hands, everybody's going to wake up. The dangerous ones, the less dangerous ones, the friendly ones, etc. It all wakes up. He says, so too, when a person does something, even with the best intentions, everything inside of him wakes up. And each midah inside the person wants to get a piece of this action that's about to be happening. Right? He said, again, another image, it's like putting food out on a table, even if it's beautiful food, put out for a wonderful sudas mitzvah. If you got mice in the house, right, the mice are going to be there trying to get the food as well as the people who are there for the sudas mitzvah. It's just the way it happens. So he says, this is what's happening inside the Nazir. Now he wants to get deep inside the Nazir. Right? He says, first of all, just a beautiful parish. Right? There's a pasuk, Adam ein tzadik ba'aretz asher yaseh tov v'lo yechto. There's no person in the world who's such a tzaddik that he does good and doesn't do any chet. And generally that's assumed to mean, okay, even the biggest tzaddik sometimes does a chet. We're all human, it's not possible. He says, he thought of this himself and he then found it in Nefesh HaChaim. What it means is that even a tzaddik doing something good, because we're in a world in which good and bad are intermingled, there's going to be some aspect of bad, even in the good thing that the tzaddik does. Right? He says that's also going to be there. So what is the Nazir doing? The Nazir sees the world and its addiction to physicality and the results of that, and he's shocked by it. He wants to make sure that he doesn't get caught up in it so much. He may realize how caught up in it he is, and therefore he has this inner desire to do something, to detox, as we say, to be able to separate off and to elevate himself. And he's following that playbook, as I call it, that the Torah gave us. He sees corruption, he sees degradation, he sees the results of it, so therefore he wants to separate. Now he says at the moment that he decides to separate, there's something inside of him that's not happy about that. It's like, hey, you like wine. Wine is very good. Right? He says there's a pasuk, yayin lechech yinam. Wine is pleasant to the palate. Right? What are you doing? Right? You're stopping yourself from drinking wine. So now he's in conflict, and he discovers that conflict inside of himself. He's trying to take this spiritual leap, but suddenly his physicality wakes up and makes a statement also. So now he uses what you call the Maccabee Patish, the trump card, not meaning the president, but whatever it is, right, in order to lock in his decision. He brings up another feeling inside of himself, which is ketzef, anger, right? And this anger he says to himself, I'm not going to lose anything because it's all worthless. Nobody has anything. I'm not going to have anything anyway. I'm not going to enjoy anything. The world is all worthless. And that is what enables him to take the jump and to do the nezirus. So he says, so the final interaction, is that's coming to lock it in is negative. In other words, his initial desire is positive. His struggle with his desire for wine is natural. But this anger, that the only way he can do this is by negating the world so much and negating his life so much, that is something which is negative. And therefore, he says, that is what's there. He says, what's mixed up inside here is his bitterness about what he will be missing and his feelings, right? His anger that lashes out and trying to say that the world is worthless. This is an aspect of chet, which in there, especially because he says in most cases of nezirus, that is what locks it in, right? It says in the Talmud Yerushalmi, it says Shimon HaTzadik says, Sava Shimon HaTzadik, right? Again, Shimon HaTzadik said he was a Kohen Gadol. He did not like to eat the korban of a Nazir aside from the famous Nazir Shabbat Dorom. This one Nazir who came who had very beautiful hair, and he said he saw his reflection and he felt his Yetzer Hara waking up, and he says, I'm going to shave this hair off, right? L'shem Shamayim. And he was the only one who said that Yarbe Kamocha Yisrael should be Nazirim like you in the world, because he was very tomim and pashut. He was very simple. He was simply trying to save himself from something that he saw there. But most people, Shimon Tzadik says, mitoch peidahim nodrim. They're doing it out of anger. That used to be the scenario in old movies that, the girl breaks up with the guy and he goes off to join the French Foreign Legion. Right? That's it. She broke our engagement. I'm going to join the French Foreign Legion and go to the deserts of Tunisia or something. That's an idea of a decision which is made mitoch ketzef, right? Out of this anger and the sense that life is worthless anyway, and there's nothing here and there's no hope, etc. Okay, so therefore, he says, this is going to lead to something negative. Even though, right, we don't find a need to bring kapara for other things that involve chet. Meaning, if his thesis is true, that even every good thing a person does has an aspect of chet, because we're in a world in which good and bad are intermingled, this is the only place where we say the Nazir has to bring a korban because he caused himself to meet star min hayayin. So he explains this is because the Nazir is taking an optional step. He's trying to go up different from other people and to do something elevated. And therefore, that pagam, that negative part of it, he must realize that it's there. And he must realize that it has to be repaired. And he has to realize that he cannot let that aspect color the nezirus that he took upon himself. That's why he has to bring that korban. Why not exposing yourself to death? Why? In other words, if nezirus is an idea of separating off from addiction to physicality, why wouldn't the Nazir want to go to cemeteries? Right? Wouldn't that be good? Right? To go to sit in the cemetery and to yell Kizeh Kol Adam, right? All these like these things. So Hirsch explains the following. Right? He says that the Nazir stands in danger, right, by separating off in a certain way from society and from life. You can end up actually becoming more focused on the physical if you don't attain the spiritual levels that you wanted to attain with the nezirus, and you can end up focusing on the most powerful force in nature, which is death. In other words, if we combine this with what Rav Bloch said, It's almost like saying the whole Olam Hazeh is worthless anyway, because you're just going to die. You're just going to die, right? Right? Akol Hevel, it's all nothing, worthless. All these things. There was a strange story that I saw. I don't want to mention the name of the person who was said about because it's strange to me, the story. I'll explain. He was a big person, far bigger than me, but he was a person of a very strong flavor of Musar. And he said he was on a fundraising trip someplace in Chutz La'aretz, and he went to the house of a wealthy person, and the wife brought out the most ornate piece of cake that he ever saw. It was like 7 layers with cream and strawberries and chocolate dripping off of it. And he said he looked at this thing, he said, and it just got him thinking about Olam Hazeh. And he said, in my mind, I see Olam Hazeh as a leprous pig, right? A chazir mitzora whose flesh is rotting. And I couldn't help myself and I threw up all over the cake. Right? This is what he said. Now, again, what bothered me about that was, I would think the idea in Chabad, there's always the phrase, moach shalit al halev. The mind is supposed to rule over the heart. This woman's probably going to feel very bad, right, with this. Again, I'm sure he couldn't help himself. Place. Anyway, that's a bit, right, the fancy stuff, which is there. So that's tricky. So Rav Hirsch said, this person who's angry in this way, so it might be that everything that he looks at now is all ruled over by death, which we learned a piece from Rav Hirsch earlier in the year, I think in Parshas Emor, where this danger is of almost worship of death, viewing death as the most powerful thing in the world, that thing which no one can escape. Whereas we believe, he says, in Elokim Chaim, in the God of life, right? The Kohen Gadol says, where's on the tzitz, it says, Kodesh LaHashem, Yud-Kei Vov-Kei, Haya Hoy V'Viyeh, eternal life. That's what we're connected to. The transition from life in this world to the next world is simply a transition from one life to another life. So we always have to take these steps against this, letting the power of death focus our lives. So therefore, he must stay away from death. He has to stay away from death because that's a great danger that he faces. This idea of deciding is all there. I'd mentioned to you once, right, the Gemara talks about if a person feels that the Yetzer Hara has grabbed him and he's about to do an Avera. So it gives the order. I think I may have mixed up the order last time. I'll probably mix it up again right now. The steps are to learn Torah, to say Kriya Shema, right? And the last is Yazkir Lo Yom HaMisa. Remember the day of death. So whichever one came first in that order, the first one, so there's a Perush on the Ein Yaakov, Chidushe Anshe Shem, I think it's called, and they said, you're dealing with the Yetzer Hara. You're on the edge of doing some kind of Avera. Clearly, in terms of gradation here, the last weapon is the biggest, right? In other words, the first one didn't work. The second one didn't work. Looks like the third one is a sure thing that that's going to work. So why not pull that out in the beginning? Why mess around? So a couple answers are brought. One answer is that has very limited power. In other words, a person gets used to that very quickly. This idea that why do the Avera, you're just going to die, right? That mouthful of pleasure isn't going to mean anything at the end of your life, etc. People can get used to anything, right? At one point, the Surgeon General in America, right, first they used to say smoking is dangerous to your health, and they had to put it on every box. Then they tried to put up, pictures of lungs with cancer and everything. All right, people got used to it, and they're just puffing, right, to the extent that there was a brand of cigarettes that was popular among young people, and it was called Black Death cigarettes. And the picture on the cover was a skeleton, like with a top hat and tuxedo, smoking a cigarette, saying underneath, I smoke them because I like them. Meaning just laughing in the face of the death. It doesn't do so much, but there's a deeper idea. The deeper idea is that a Jew is not meant to live that way. Our life is because of Kriya Shema, because of Torah, because what we believe in, of what we know, not just the fact that it's not going to be worth it because you're just going to die anyway. That does not bring what's called the Lebedika Jew. What is a Lebedika Jew? We see him in Megillas Rus that's coming up. Boaz is described as an Ish Chayil. Ish Chayil. So years ago, I heard Rabbi Victor Miller Zatzal speaking on Megillas Rus, and he said, "What is an Ish Chayil?" So he said, in his own unique way of speaking, he says that means that the Eibishter does not want a frum log, right? Meaning you're not supposed to be a shtick holz. You're not supposed to be a piece of wood. Yeah, you're supposed to be lebedik. You're supposed to be full of life. That's our picture. Boaz was an Ish Chayil who was full of life. The Ish Chayil is not just, in the picture in the bencher, the nice lady making the bracha and the candle. That's also nice. She's an Ish Chayil. She's a fighter. She's alive. She's out. She's doing. She's motivated by the positive, not by the negative. So that's why it's so important to see that there. So this is why very few Nazirim nowadays, right? There was the one Nazir, right? The Talmud of Rav Kook, Rav David HaKohen. I once met his son, Rav Haifa, in Boston. I was talking to him about it a little bit. I didn't get quite clear. Rabbi Wein, as I remember it, Rabbi Wein tells the story. He said his grandfather knew both Rav Kook and the Nazir. His grandfather knew Rav Kook from Volozhin, and the Nazir also learned in Volozhin. May all forgive me if I get it wrong. Right? He said that there was a certain trend of some boys leaving Volozhin and going to Switzerland to study in university. Rav Kook ended up getting stuck in both England and Switzerland, right, during World War I times, because he had gone to a meeting of the Aguda actually in Europe. I believe that was the meeting, and he was stuck with the wrong passport. So he was there. So in Switzerland, right, what there was before television, any of these things for nighttime entertainment, they would have what's called like a salon, which means that you would invite interesting people over to your house to talk, or maybe someone who would do a presentation or something like this. So there was a frum Jew in Switzerland who had over important people who were there and introduced this young David Cohen to Rav Kook and said, this young man is a student here in the university, and he also learned in Volozhin, as you did. And the way he said it, again, I've seen other, this is the one I heard from Rabbi Wein. He says, yeah, that's a good source. So Rav Kook looked at him and said, David, was macht von sich narrisch? Said, David, what are you making yourself foolish? And he said that Rav Kook's words came into him like and entered every bone in his body. And that was where he started to have the idea to take upon himself nezirus. Okay, again, right, something, I'm sure there may have been many other things, and nezirus, because you can't bring the korbanos nowadays and do these things, so he was a nazir for the rest of his life, right? And he had to do all these interesting things, how he made kiddush, how he did this, etc. So even though it's very rare nowadays for a person to be a nazir, this idea is something that we have to learn, right? So many times the Yetzer Hara can take our positive energy and trip us up, because he's there. He's there in everything that we do, right? That's this idea of the tarovas tov v'ra. So therefore, you can want to really do something out of passionate, zealousness for Hashem and His Torah, but you can end up doing something very wrong at the same time. You have to be aware of what's happening inside, and that very detailed progression that Rav Bloch gave, that person who's drawing back, trying to fight his addiction to different physical things, and the way he sees those will end up in a disaster. On the other hand, having to deal with the fact that he's human and he wants those things, and then opting to this angry cutting off and negating everything to the extent, as Rav Hirsch says, of almost just focusing on death, that can be very negative. And that's how that chait can be there, even though he's doing a mitzvah, even though the Torah calls him kadosh, even though it calls his period of nezirus a nezer, a crown. Okay, so this is something that all of us has to realize at different times. The more we know about ourselves, and the Torah reveals secrets about ourselves, Rav Bloch says, with small things like this, we get to see what's there and keep our eyes open for it, and hopefully be able to do things in the right way. Wishing everyone a wonderful Kabbalah Satorah, a good Yom Tov, Chag HaBikurim, and looking forward to seeing you again.